dear friends, this is Agitprop Live Talk. Here we regularly discuss what's going on with the global economy or the Russian economy, and typically there's no lack of gloomy projections in both regards. As we are all witnessing now, some of them come true, which doesn't fill us with happiness, of course. Nevertheless, we'd like to move on in this analysis, and so let us introduce you our new guest. Please welcome Patrick Bond, professor in political economy right from South Africa, where he teaches at the University of the Western Cape School of Government.
Nice to meet you, Konstantin. Thanks for having me.
So as we're speaking, the global markets are in free fall and nobody is willing to predict what's going to happen next because everybody's so scared. How do you see the situation? Is it totally explainable through the impact of the virus, of the potential pandemic?
Yes, I think, Konstantin, it's both a short-term catalyst that reveals the vulnerabilities of very, very fragile, just-in-time capitalism, where these disruptions of the supply chains and the fear of debt default because of the inability to make payments is an obvious reason that capitalists will be panicky. But there's a longer-term problem, which is, as Marx put it in Das Kapital, overaccumulation, overproduction. And we've been seeing a world economy, especially driven from China, extremely productive, but too productive. And you could take something as simple as steel, the most elemental commodity form that capital takes iron ore and coal, makes steel. And there's about 1 billion tons a year that's coming out. And in Russia, you've had some major investments. Roman Abramovich, who then invests through Avras into South Africa, into England, all over, but becomes exposed because the Chinese are producing more effectively. And that's the durable problem, overproduction. From overproduction, you have deindustrialization. Many countries' steel industries, like South Africa's, are just dying. So it makes the entire fabric of capitalism more vulnerable to this kind of chaos. And okay, the chaos is coming from China through the coronavirus. So that's affecting trade and now finance and maybe production. But it really is a system that has led itself to a vulnerability through excessive globalization, excessive financialization, and excessive production. It's something Karl Marx would recognize instantly and then say, okay, it's coronavirus today, it might be something else another day, but the system has become so fragile, whatever it is that pushes it over reflects a deeper problem of the contradictions of capitalism.
Many people are still believing, are still hoping that once we're done with this pandemic, as Trump said, it's not going to last for long, it will all get back to normal.
You could say that if we were just in a recovery stage in which this growth process had not really picked up the momentum. But don't forget, now we're 11 years into the recovery. It's been very slow by historical standards. And it's usually every 10 or 11 years that the business cycle peaks and crashes. So Trump might have been right if this was in 2009, 10, 11, after the worst period. But now we're in a vulnerable situation, and I think it's a good bet, as the bankers and stock market traders are doing, that they're calling in, they're selling out, they're protecting themselves. Cash is king. It's a classic problem, isn't it? It happened in 2008 and 9, in 2000, 2001 with the dot-com. It happened in the early 90s with real estate. These cycles, I mean, we could go back to the 1930s where Western capitalism was at its worst and most, therefore, internally contradictory, internecine, geopolitically fragile mode, and the result was war. Now, the dilemma is Donald Trump runs for re-election in November. He's already threatened Iran, North Korea, Venezuela. Will he create a war out of this tension to create artificial demand and distract people from the problems and try to get support? So this is a very crazy US president who, when he sees a stock market, his place, his people are gamblers, and they're now running for the exit. What will he do to stop them? It's anybody's guess.
One other popular notion is crises are natural, are essential for capitalism, and capitalism is somehow capable of overcoming them. And we'll see that in the future. Do you believe that?
Yes, the dilemma, as Joseph Schumpeter said, is that capitalism destroys. He said it was creative destruction. You get new technologies and they wipe out the old. Today, the new technologies are called the fourth industrial revolution, with robotics, with artificial intelligence, with nanotechnology, biotechnology, lots of new ideas. And one of the big results is mass unemployment. Service sector workers, drivers, technicians, bank tellers, they lose their jobs. And that's what's different. The technologies that one would want to see are solar and wind and the kind of biological advances that help us solve ecological damage. But no, we're getting instead money-saving, big data-driven, consumption-oriented systems. So one of the solutions, if you listen to the World Economic Forum, this is sort of the brain of the bourgeoisie in Davos, Switzerland, and they're saying, well, maybe we should give people some money, a basic income grant. Maybe we're going to fire everybody. Let's at least have some consumption to keep the system going. That's how, let's say, contradictory it all is. And that's why the typical clearing of the dead wood doesn't work. If you think of the last huge crisis, it was World War II and the Great Depression that was required to get rid of the overproduction, the dead wood. Wipe out Germany, wipe out Japan, wipe out France and British production through bombing. Now, if that were to occur today with nuclear weapons, the end of life. And it's that dilemma that world capital faces. It's not being managed well. There's very little global governance that's worthy of the name. And so that's why that prediction, capitalism always goes through cleansings of business cycles, and then it comes out stronger. Yeah, that's been true. Things are more dangerous now.
And what's needed today, as what I see, and many other people I assume, is a coordinated effort to tackle at least this particular problem, these epidemics, and capitalism is unable to provide it.
That's true on not just the health front, because there may be some treatment. In fact, it might be similar to AIDS treatments, which involved antiretroviral medicines. They came from the Western public health system, and they were captured by pharmaceutical companies. They were unaffordable. Africans died by the millions. Until in 2001, Africans, along with their allies, Médecins Sans Frontières, US activists called ACT UP, even Oxfam, they said together, we must have the medicines free. And that was the way in which, in South Africa, the life expectancy, which went from 64 to 52 over about 5 years at the turn of the century, shot up again today to 65, because about 6 million people get AIDS medicines now for free because of a social struggle to decommodify. Now that's the dilemma for the coronavirus. It might be that there is something similar. In fact, even Chinese doctors are treating corona with antiretrovirals, with the same AIDS medicines. But it's a big question. Can capitalism identify a system-threatening problem? And it might be coronavirus, but let's take the biggest,
and
climate change.
Because one recent thing that we heard of is the United States objecting the Chinese effort to establish an antivirus, anti-disease, anti-infection center in Ethiopia, if I'm not mistaken. Isn't it an epitome of such competition?
It is, and I mean, another reflection is, as we speak, the United States is opposing fair use on the kinds of things you do, Konstantin, which is, production of good interviews, and we would like to use some sound bites, but no intellectual property stops South Africans from using this kind of interview or a bit of music or some ideas or a cartoon. And fair use is a critical concept to free the airwaves, to decommodify ideas, to mash up the best knowledge in the society to get even further. And the United States right now is threatening South Africa not to put in the same fair use that it has in the United States. And the threat is, if you have a fair use doctrine in intellectual property that relaxes those constraints, then the United States will chop the, it's called a African Growth and Opportunity Act, trade benefits, which are about $5 billion a year. It'll be very serious. These are the power relations that Donald Trump has continued from Barack Obama. Obama was brutal in the same way. It's protecting big corporates. And as you know, in the United States, it's a bought democracy. You live there, you'd see advertisements. Today it's Michael Bloomberg spending $1 billion of his own money on advertisements, but it's a general system in which politicians are purchased, and that means that they pass laws or they put pressure on countries that want to escape. We did have a great breakthrough. I mean, to defeat intellectual property on medicines, essential medicines, has led to millions of people living. So I can't say this is hopeless, but it does require that kind of coordinated battle that involves activists, HIV positive, people living with HIV across Africa. And they actually found some unity with United Nations, UNAIDS, with the World Health Organization. And it's a very difficult thing to find today. So I was just saying the biggest problem is climate change. It's the catastrophe. And the African continent that made no contribution to this problem but suffers all of the damage that you can imagine. I mean, last year in Mozambique, the cyclones killed 1,000 people. That was because the water in the Mozambique Channel was warm and it created much more intense cyclones. And that kind of damage is being done to Africa by the North, including South Africa, which is in the North in terms of climate, as is damage, as is Russia. And it's that damage that we can't see capitalism solving. They have an ideology in capitalism. Let's internalize externalities. Let's take the contradictions. Let's find solutions to a market problem with a market solution. The solution for climate change is called carbon trading, emissions trading. So you can privatize the air, commodify it and sell the right to pollute, and then that'll make an efficient system, so you will solve climate change by making it more expensive and letting people trade the right to pollute. That was a strategy. It began in about 2005, the Kyoto Protocol, that was established to allow a United Nations carbon market. And it started in Europe, and then it moved to the US, and now in China. It hasn't worked. It's been a disaster. Mainly because, just think about it, if you want to solve the worst problem in the world, climate change, do you give it to bankers to set up a market in the privatized air? It's insane. And that's exactly the dilemma when you have a neoliberal United Nations, a World Bank and an IMF, a World Trade Organization. They only think about money. That's the only thing they understand. They can't think of a social solution. The solution we had for a similar crisis, it was in 1987, there was an ozone problem, right? The ozone hole was expanding because of chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, that, under your arm deodorant or a refrigerator. And what they did then was brilliant. They just said, stop, ban it. Don't allow any more chlorofluorocarbons. We have to save the ozone hole. And it's a measure of the backwardness of neoliberalism that everything that you could do in 1987, I mean, it was Thatcher, it was Reagan, but they could still ban chlorofluorocarbons. And we need to do that with greenhouse gases, CO2, methane. Russia would be...
It becomes impossible today.
It becomes impossible because the capitalist system got much more powerful, and their ideology, which is that market solutions, not state solutions.
You mentioned Marx twice, and it seems like the equation, the dilemma, is unchanged since the 19th century. It's the public production versus private appropriation. And I just wanted to ask you, since when do you feel it? Since when do you believe that Marx was right? What made you a Marxist?
Yes, I probably learned Marxist economic theory during a prior capitalist crisis, when I was working in the Federal Reserve, the United States Central Bank. I was doing my studies, yeah. And the reason is I studied at where Donald Trump graduated, if you can imagine, the Wharton School in the University of Pennsylvania, which is the school for training the worst parasitical banksters. It's a terrible place. And I realized then they didn't understand the third world debt crisis. That was a big problem then. In fact, it was a problem in Poland. It was a problem in Russia. It was why Jaruzelski, clamped down on Solidarność, because the German bankers told him he had to repay the debt. So all over Eastern Europe, Latin America, Africa, Asia, there was a third world debt crisis. And I was beginning to understand that the bankers, who seemed to be so powerful, so wise, so capable, were actually the vehicle for the crises that Karl Marx had understood. So he understood it as too much production because you have a competitive instinct between capitalists. So they overproduce because they're all fighting for each other. They're trying to mechanize, and therefore, as they replace labor with capital, they remove the source of their profit. We would call that surplus value. It would be the basis for capital getting profit out of labor, but they're competitive. They need to become more mechanized. We call that the organic composition rising. Now, when they become mechanized, they produce too much. Now then, in a company, the treasurer says to the owner, you know, we've got way too many inventories from producing too much. We've wiped out our competitors, but we still are producing too much. Our productive forces are very strong. The relations of production and consumption are not so strong. So what it means is they then start gambling. They move the money from the productive investment. They don't invest in any more machines. They have too many. And they find things like the stock market or bond market or creative financial instruments. So we've seen a financialization. That's one of the techniques that capital uses as a temporary band-aid. Another is to move the problem around. So then we saw more globalization. In the early 80s, when I was working in this Federal Reserve, you were a bank, you couldn't move very far. So they liberalized, so the banks started moving. And more of the third world debt and more of the gambling, the different financial instruments. You know, you probably heard of subprime mortgages. They gambled in sort of second and third generation bets on real estate, right? So they moved the money around and they played financial games.
So they were fighting bubbles with bubbles.
Bubbles with bubbles. So the first argument is capitalism overproduces. That's the classical Marxist argument. Marx then said, yeah, and then you have financialization. Then you have financial bubbles. That was in his volume 3. He also vaguely understood, and we understand much better now, David Harvey's geography helps, that there's a geographical movement. And then the third phenomenon, which Lenin and Bukharin started to discuss, because they wrote in 1916, 1919, the big stories of imperialism, so they could see the capital moving. But what they needed was Rosa Luxemburg, 1913. Her book, Accumulation of Capital, helped to fill in the story with a third strategy. So financialization is one management strategy, spatial, geographical management, and the third one is, it's war, but it's also something even bigger. It's stealing. It's called accumulation by dispossession. For Rosa, it was the capital and the non-capitalist. So it was where you would find, for example, capitalists moving to Africa. What would they find? Women doing mutual aid, natural systems, men having traditional ethnic rule. And so capital would break it. And they would look for the minerals and the plantations. They'd invade through the Berlin Conference in 1885, set up countries completely distinct from the actual existence of peoples, very disruptive to natural logics. So in stealing, in what we would call imperialism, the colonial powers helped capitalism to move around, but not just to geographically shift, but to steal. And stealing through privatization, I mean, here you had in the 1990s the worst case of stealing by capital. You have techniques like carbon trading, where everything, including the air, is up for sale. So I think the interesting question, so capital does this to survive. It finds creative techniques to move around. And then the question is, when do they run out of steam?
Yes.
And
when?
that's what we are looking at right now. Whether it's climate crisis that's so evident, or financial bubbles, the debt levels, the stock market levels are too high, they're bursting, and the vulnerability of the system to some little problem, coronavirus. It's a little problem, maybe it will kill 2% of the people who get it, but you can see the control of that problem means the supply chains, the global value chains, the shipping, the aircraft, the transport systems now are paralyzed.
It becomes a straw that breaks the...
Yes, I mean, what it means is capitalism, as it goes through the financial, the geographical, and the stealing, we call this shifting, stalling and stealing. It moves the problem around, but it does it with a philosophy, just in time. It makes itself vulnerable, and the just-in-time system now is threatened. So global value chains, at the peak, 2008, were about 30% of the output. Now they're down to 20, and now these days they're crashing to nothing. So we're going to see shortages, people will be stocking up, people will go into debt default, and it could be a really serious run. Not because just coronavirus, but because systematic vulnerabilities mean we have countries that are just like Russia, producing raw materials. Your oil and gas is what drives this country. For South Africa, it's minerals.
If at some point there's no market, there's no consumption, we all
paralysis. Screwed. We're all screwed until now. In the 1930s, two things happened. One was in the realm of the ideas. A man called John Maynard Keynes came up to save capitalism from itself, and his solution was the state must move in because the private sector is in a debt trap. It's kind of paralyzed.
That's how the labor armies appeared.
Yes, so we have social democracy and welfare states and state intervention to boost demand. But the other thing that happened was destruction. So Joseph Schumpeter, an economist, said, when you get too exposed and new technologies come in, you just wipe out the inefficient systems. Now, it isn't just because technological change. In the case of the 1930s, it was the most destructive war. I don't have to say to any Russian, massive destruction of your industrial base was the prerequisite, well, certainly in Japan and Germany, for the West to revive, because then they could replace the old stuff with brand new, efficient stuff. And then the systems allowed Japan and Germany to become the most efficient producers by the 1970s.
So killing was the way to rejuvenate the system?
Yeah, killing economic deadwood, and whether or not people are involved, capitalism doesn't care. So sometimes this is managed because capitalists can get together. And I feel that in the last big threat, do you remember 2008 and 9? So at that point, before Russia had been kicked out of the G8, the G7, the G8 said, you know what we need? We need a G20. We need to bring in new countries, and we need China. And we need South Africa as the only African country. We need Brazil. We need Turkey. We need Saudi Arabia. What we need is a new layer of the second tier, and I would call these the sub-imperial countries, because they had surplus. China had $3 trillion in their reserves. Russia had big reserves already. These countries were beginning to come out of their very weak stage and accumulate. So what the West did, and it was really at that time George W. Bush in 2008 and then Barack Obama, and they pulled a G20 to assimilate countries. And that's, I think, where the power of the BRICS suddenly appeared. And since Russia will be hosting the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa network, and there was so much hope that multipolarity would not only assimilate a G20, the BRICS plus some other countries, with the G7, but would also make for a different system, a reformed system. There was hope 10 years ago that the BRICS could say maybe the IMF and the World Bank should not be run by a European and an American and be so neoliberal.
Right? I remember they also talked about the global government and some special body to deal with the overreaching problems of humanity. But it didn't work back then.
Yes, that's right. The BRICS had so much, let's say, rhetorical anti-imperialism to demand a fairer system, one that would distribute not only the resources but the power. So, for example, the IMF and the World Bank, so the International Monetary Fund, took Yeltsin down in 1997 and made life miserable. Every Russian remembers. But the World Bank made lots of crazy loans, project loans that were stupid. The World Trade Organization was biased to big corporations. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change wasn't really doing anything. So the hope, if you can even remember Copenhagen, Russia was not there, but at the table was the United States. Barack Obama barged in to the Copenhagen meeting of the United Nations Climate Summit, and he found Wen Jiabao from China, Manmohan Singh from India, Lula from Brazil, and Jacob Zuma, and they did a deal, the Copenhagen Accord, that became the Paris Climate Accord. So the hope was that by being strong and together, this next layer,
they can fix it.
Yeah, would become the emerging economies. A man called Jim O'Neill from Goldman Sachs said, these are the economies that will take over. So let's think back. Now, what happened after that? That was the hope. So the reality was different. And although China picked up a massive amount of responsibility for boosting the world economy, 2009 to 2011, Constantino, they used more cement in China than the United States used in the 20th century. It was a phenomenal inward boom of public works, of trains and roads and new airports. All sorts of things were being built in China. So that brought in the raw materials from Africa. Africa was rising, was booming. So even though there was a big capitalist crisis in 2008, two things were happening. That was one, which was China picking up. The other was in the West, they threw money. It was called quantitative easing. They just threw money at this capitalist crisis. They lowered the interest rates, to zero. They gave bank bailouts without any questions, no matter how badly the bankers were behaving. If you look at all of those techniques of dealing with capitalism in the West through throwing money, and in the East by industrial expansion, Moscow as well was beginning to boom, and the oil price picked up again after a crash. That looked like it might be the solution, but then it didn't work because 3 of the BRICS went into a recession within a couple of years: Russia, Brazil, and South Africa. So India was booming with a new liberalized system and drawing in service sector employment, call centers, and so forth. China continued to boom because of its managed economy and global uneven development. And what that meant was the BRICS became distorted. And in each of the BRICS, super exploitation systems. So in China, it's the rural labor. It's the workers from the rural areas going to the cities, but not really being paid anything like the fair value of their wages. In India, all kinds of super exploitative systems. But I would worry about places like South Africa or Brazil or Russia, because of that super exploitation, you then turn more to primary product exports and you push more oil out. South Africa pushes more minerals out. Brazil pushes more agricultural products, but it doesn't help. You keep pushing into the economy, and it's then the global commodity prices crash. 2014, 2015, they go down, and that's the period of the recessions. So BRICS is not anymore a vehicle. Also, right-wing governments take over. I mean, Narendra Modi takes over in 2014.
Bolsonaro.
And Jair Bolsonaro takes over in 2018.
But was it ever a real alternative to...
I don't think so. Now, here's why I think if
to me it looked like another polar of the same system.
Exactly. It's
the
what
same
I would
imperialist system.
It's a sub-imperial amplification because the strategy was not to displace the West and to have a delinking and to have a, let's call it a sort of an insulation from the crazy Western materialism, ecological destruction, financial.
Yes, they were not socialists. They were not building another world.
The BRICS just wanted to seat at the
negotiate,
table.
negotiate their place in this world.
So let's look at how they did that. So, for example, in the period 2010 to 2015, they took probably the most destructive agency in the world, the International Monetary Fund, and instead of trying to disempower it, the BRICS tried to empower it by giving it over $100 billion in new capital. So what did they get? So they said, especially China drove it, $41 billion in extra capital going into the IMF. So they said, well, what do we want? We want more voting power. So they got 37% increase between 2010 and the 2015 restructuring of the vote. Brazil got 23% because Lula thought, oh, we can buy into it. India got 11, and even under Putin, Russia invested 8% more increase, right, in voting power. So who lost? Because if the BRICS are going up, well, you can see Nigeria lost 41% of its vote, because when somebody goes up within 100%, somebody is going down. Venezuela lost 41. Libya lost 39. I mean, the Asian and African and Latin American countries, even South Africa lost 21. What I would call that, then, Constantine, is not fighting the system, it's joining it. And when we were against apartheid, we had a choice. It was, do you polish the chains of oppression, or do you break the chains? It's a very simple reform or transformation debate. The BRICS leaders, every year getting together, including in Ufa in 2015. That was a critical meeting. They kept saying, well, the West is weak, maybe we should take over these institutions and gradually...
So they saw themselves as a substitution.
Exactly, yeah. So they had that
as a successor.
Ambition, which was to get a seat at the table. And so in joining the system, they therefore amplified the contradiction. So that means if a Russian company comes to Southern Africa, allow me to name them.
Go ahead. What do they do there?
Okay, so
it would be interesting for us to know.
Roman Abramovich with Everest Highfeld. Okay, he has a soccer team. He needs to buy big players. So he takes a company in South Africa. It's the second biggest steel company, Everest Highfeld, and he milks it. He just shuts down any possibility of that company being a genuine input into the production system and into development and having backward-forward linkages. He just shuts it down. He takes whatever he can, sells it, and it's one of the companies that go under when the Chinese are dumping on him. It's a tragedy. I mean, the other in South Africa is owned by an Indian named Lakshmi Mittal. So look, we thought these guys, hey, they're not Western capitalists.
But they act the same.
They're Indian capitalists, they're Russian capitalists, they're Chinese, but they're more cannibalistic, right, through their competition than they are cooperative. And so the whole system's falling apart. We used to do 9 million tons of steel a year, now it's down to about 5. And China used to do 700 million tons, now it's 1 billion, they can't stop producing. That's part of the internal dynamic in which BRICS capitalism amplifies the contradictions. I could go on, I mean, look.
Tell us more.
Well,
what are the other names?
Rosatom has come to South Africa with $100 billion worth of nuclear deals. And unfortunately for them, they chose the wrong partner, a president named Jacob Zuma. And Jacob Zuma came to Moscow in 2014. He was poisoned with ricin and he needed to be rehabilitated. And Vladimir Putin was great, hospitality. But unfortunately, that was the time to do deals. And the deals for Rosatom, 8 nuclear facilities, $100 billion, were corrupt. And the reason is they brought in 3 Indian brothers, notorious brothers called the Guptas, and they did the uranium supply. So it went to court, and the activists mobilized, the lawyers, and they pushed it back. And so Rosatom isn't going to come and do nuclear. Now, you Russians lost $100 billion of business because you chose the wrong partners. Let me use another example. A bank, VTB, makes a loan to the Mozambican elites in partnership with Credit Suisse, a terrible Swiss bank, very corrupt. And that loan is full of gimmicks, and they don't even report the loan as their international lending requirements. It's just a secret loan for the Mozambican ruling class. It's for tuna ships. It never gets paid, and it's a big scandal, and they can't pay it back. Zimbabwe has a good example of platinum by a Russian company, Rostec, in exchange. Over the last 5-6 years, lots of debates what was going on, but it looked like it was a deal, platinum for arms, to keep down an angry population repressed by dictatorships, first Mugabe, now Mnangagwa. In other words, the Russians, like the Chinese, like the Indians, like the Brazilians.
Acting like the old-time imperialists. They are just robbing the country, they are just sucking the blood out.
Even worse, yeah. That's the tragedy of the sub-imperial position, because the sub-imperialists grow up under conditions like Russia in the 90s, Wild West capitalism.
Because they were themselves exploited.
They themselves became rich. Think of South African capitalists during a crime against humanity, apartheid. I'm thinking of Anglo-American Corporation, De Beers Corporation, the biggest companies in Africa, got rich in South Africa through extreme racism and ecological looting. So of course, when they become BRICS companies, the schizophrenia, because they're trying to be brothers, the new, more conscious, more equitable, multipolar world. Hey, and the reality, they can talk left, but you watch, they walk right.
Yeah, and they have right-wing members within the company now, which only raises the competition.
And if you take Brazil, it's not
what's going to happen with the right-wing government in India and the right-wing government in Brazil.
But they can take the left down. I mean,
and both of them are anti-Chinese, as far as I get.
Well, it's curious. So if you take Brazil, Bolsonaro starts by being xenophobic or concerned about Chinese buying too much. Now he's in power, he's happy to do more deals because the soy market, since the United States is sort of in question.
Goes to China.
would be his friends in the agricultural industry, so he's become pragmatic. India and China have an incredibly tense relationship, especially in Pakistan, in the Kashmir area, where the Gwadar port, which gives Western China access immediately to the Indian Ocean and therefore to oil, instead of the long, dangerous oil route that goes through Macau and through the Straits. All of that is critical for China to have a Belt and Road initiative and to link to Russia. But the Indians are completely opposed. Well, Modi is because he's a nationalist, but he says, hey, Kashmir is mine. That's our territory. This is just one of many contradictions. I mean, they're fighting in Bhutan. There's contradictions in the way in which India's lined up with Japan. And now the last period is Modi and Trump, Bolsonaro and Trump. Now, how are we going to have Vladimir Putin hosting the BRICS in St. Petersburg?
This summer.
He's the most brilliant politician in the world, Putin, no question. But these are contradictions that mean an agenda to save the world. I wouldn't expect the BRICS to come up with it, given these appalling political alliances.
So it's being torn apart.
Yeah,
there's these contradictions.
Exactly the right metaphor is a centrifugal force. So if you, for example, have a child and you spin your child around, it's a centrifugal force. It moves outward as you go around. You better hold on to your child. Xi Jinping had a different theory. It was a centripetal BRICS. The BRICS would spin around the world, globalization would work, the BRICS would get closer. If you flush your toilet, the water gets closer. It's a centripetal BRICS. So this is the central problem. Do the BRICS move together as they spin, or are they falling apart? Are they breaking apart because of the contradictions? Is the steel industry a good example of Chinese overproduction? Evros Heifeld from Russia, the ArcelorMittal empire from India, technically in Luxembourg, but Luxemburg, the South African workers. Those are the forces that should work in harmony, but in fact they're being utterly destroyed.
And I can tell you how it is, at least on the Russian side, how it is being interpreted and presented to the public. I mean, our presence there. Russia is expanding its business interests overseas. It's making Africa's life easier and more comfortable and healthier, and et cetera, et cetera. It's creating jobs there and it's bringing jobs home. And that's why we need all the weapons sold to the African governments, and that's why we're sending private armies the same trajectory as well. This is how it is being wrapped and sold.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, if you look at the old imperial project, going back to colonialism, and when in this city, Vladimir Lenin or Bukharin were thinking about imperialism, they would warn, there could be some rhetoric. In fact, if you read in 1916, he was in Switzerland, Lenin was writing imperialism, looking at the British press, and he found a beautiful paragraph where Cecil Rhodes, who's the most infamous colonialist in Africa's history, along with King Leopold of Belgium in the Congo, but Cecil Rhodes wanted Cape to Cairo, the most expansive, aggressive, looting, slaving imperialist from the time. He was in the late 19th century. Here's what Lenin said. He said, Cecil Rhodes was visiting East London, and in London, he saw the angry workers. He said to his friend who took him there, if you want to solve the problem of your working class, you must become an imperialist, my friend. Meaning, let's take those angry white workers and move them
on board
to South Africa, to Zimbabwe, Rhodesia. And it was that displacement of the North's problems, overproduction, angry workers, that helps to explain the scramble for Africa at that very time, right? This is one of the great ironies, is that what we really needed was worker solidarity, internationalism, an ideology that was at its peak, I think, in 1917 here and in St. Petersburg, that is worker internationalism. We didn't get it. Lenin talked about a labor aristocracy, and it's the same problem we have today. We have workers in the US, workers in Britain, workers in Hungary, who are blaming their problems.
Bribed by the
They're bribed, but their consciousness is also one in which, instead of confronting their capitalist class, they're blaming the immigrants, right? And the xenophobia is a replacement for an internationalism, and that's our most important challenge in the world today.
And could you give us your take on the current state of the workers' movement internationally?
Yeah, it's at a very uneven level of consciousness, because factories are being phased out in favor of 3D printing and robotics and all sorts of techniques that weaken the power of workers. The outsourcing problem, the 0 hours and the gig economy, everything that would bring the worker class together in a factory where they could unionize, or in a big service sector site they can get together. Everything's splintering. So what we understand is the vehicle for changing history, a trade union and a political party of the workers. The old Bolshevik model is very difficult. So what we're seeing instead is anger, and it's taking the form of populist protests. Some of the protests are right-wing, and you can feel that with xenophobic upsurges. South Africa is a good example. Some of them have potential. So today, let's say the last 6 months, since September 2019, a quarter of the world has been in protest. I mean, this is something that political consultancies are telling their corporate clients.
Quarter of the
from
world.
Chile, from Lebanon, Haiti, little countries, to bigger countries. I mean, you can look at the various protests that occur in Hong Kong and mainland China. I mean, factory protests, environmental protests. You can look at sites of contradiction in the Middle East and North Africa. I mean, we had Algeria overthrown, dictatorship of the Bouteflika former liberation regime last year, or Sudan, al-Bashir, overthrown. So mass protests, South Africa, Nigeria, Morocco, the countries where you find the contradictions bubbling up. There is protest, and it is working class and poor people, but it's not through unions at the point of production, and it's not through a socialist party. And I think we have to address this. It's, you know, in Africa, Frantz Fanon was very worried. In 60 years ago, he said that wherever he goes in Africa, Frantz Fanon is sort of great liberation analyst, the thing that worries him the most is the lack of ideology. Now, Marx didn't help these movements, social movements, urban movements, peasant movements, because his theory of overthrowing capitalism was based on the producer withdrawing labor, affecting the profit system. So I think we need a bigger Marxism that takes the contradictions of capitalism everywhere they appear.
So the lack of ideology you're talking about is equal to lack of theory in the minds.
So the climate crisis gives us a chance to say, can we solve this world threatening, existential crisis using capitalist techniques? And there are some very persuasive people like Al Gore, the former US vice president who won a Nobel Prize, or most of the United Nations system, the World Bank, and JP Morgan has a new report. And they would like market systems to send the signals to not invest in coal companies, to have carbon taxes or cap and trade and carbon trading and offsets and techniques, especially technological fixes. Hey, solar will be cheaper. That would be beautiful if capitalism could solve its problems. But it's very evident that we're at a point where you can't expect bankers.
No, I was referring to the revolutionary theory.
So yeah,
so that's the class consciousness which is absent.
Well, and it's not just class, it's ecological, it's gender, it's race, it's the variety of oppressions. So if you live in a city like Moscow and things aren't working, and can you come to the streets? I mean, it's happening across Russia. It's a dilemma where often we always look to the most immediate target. It might be my city council person who's not delivering. It might be the electricity company. But the difficulty is saying, let's put these grievances that seem to be in the silo, one after the other, disconnected. Let's put them together. We probably need a political party. I haven't seen any that really inspire. What I'm curious, in the most difficult place to be a socialist, it looks like today the opinion polls predict a socialist will be president of the United States. It's amazing that Bernie Sanders is polling above Donald Trump. things will change. It's
However
fluid.
socialist he might be.
He's a Denmark socialist, yes. But the fact that you can even say socialism in a country where they had such a McCarthyite
it was unimaginable yesterday.
It was unimaginable to even say national health insurance, to a single payer, to have some health insurance, or to child care, to have a Green New Deal.
So Marx is slowly proving himself to be
relevant. That relevance comes in different forms. So let's say the last 20 years as a sort of period when we wanted internationalism. I'll be frank, we wanted a common turn, not the one that you had here that controlled everything, remote control, but a common turn. We called it the World Social Forum. So this was something that started in Brazil, in Porto Alegre, and the Brazilians, the Europeans, they took it over. We moved it to Africa, in Dakar, Senegal. We moved it to Nairobi, Kenya. It was in Mumbai. It was Tunisia. It was Venezuela. It was a beautiful experience. For about 10 years, it was strong. And that we thought was internationalism. We didn't realize that underneath there was some rot. And I think it came from NGOs. It came from the Ford Foundations manipulating. It was partners of Oxfam. It wasn't the genuine internationalism of the working class and poor and women and youth. It had a different character of reformist NGOs. I think we made those mistakes. And then we had another chance. Do you remember Occupy? This was 2011. So you could feel it in the Arab Spring, the North African revolts in early 2011 that kicked out the dictatorships of Tunisia and Egypt. And there was a sort of hope that the North Africans who had not been active were going to lead the world. And then the occupiers came to Zuccotti Park in New York, right?
Don't you think that because the focus was shifted from the class problems to some other minor problems, comparing them to the essential needs of the working class, it was all doomed to be,
That would be one way to look at
attempt.
it. I don't agree. I think there was an ideology that was chosen in Occupy. It was anarchism. And the slogan was good. We are the 99%, they are the 1%. But the actual strategy and the organizational form was pathetic. They said, we don't make demands. We don't have a democratic organization. We have a spokes council, and we have the sort of mass democratic events that were spectacles. And it was not just New York. I mean, it was in every major city in the world pretty much had an Occupy. It was an extraordinary September, October, November 2011. It came 3 years after the meltdown. And I think that was a genuine class response. It was people in student debt.
And then it failed. And then after it failed, it gave an opportunity for the right-wingers to say that it was Soros behind it.
Not only that, but they picked up
what I'm
the
trying
dissent.
to say that every time when a left-wing movement fails, it opens space for their opponents to step in.
Now, what if the World Social Forum had been more militant and had really prioritized radical social movements? The most important of the period, and in a way today, is the movement of landless workers who you met in Brazil, right? The MST, they had, for example, occupied land. 600,000 people had been resettled. It was extraordinary. We had shack dwellers in South Africa, and we had movements across India, the National Alliance of People's Movements. We had movements that you could say had some potential to become, I don't want to use vanguard, but they could have been leaders, right? Instead, it was more NGO driven. For the Occupy, my view is that there were excessive hopes that an anarchist mode would carry this movement forward, and it would be more than just the meme and the dissent. So what do we learn from that? I mean, that's exactly that if you don't organize, then the right wing takes the space. And that's
happening.
Exactly. It's working class people who have no future, who instead of turning to the left, because there's not a left,
manipulated.
They are manipulated, and they feel a Donald Trump or a Jair Bolsonaro or Viktor Orban or even Boris Johnson is there.
Could it lead us to a situation, as a fellow theoretician from Moscow once said, of a clash of fascist regimes, a military confrontation of the ultra right-wing governments, with the weakened as never before international workers' movement?
Yeah, it's the weakness on the left which is not sufficiently strong to maintain states once we can overthrow outgoing illegitimate states. So there's plenty of overthrows from mass movements who have democratic or anti-austerity demands. You know, until they take the kinds of steps to revive, I think it's the spirit of the 20th century of Bolshevik independence. It might not be useful to have a Comintern to direct things, but it would be the greatest African political economist, Samir Amin, he died about a year and a half ago, had a theory called delinking. Now that's not to become autarkic, but it's to begin to more explicitly reject the thesis of globalization, that the more integrated you are in the world, the more chance you have. We've now learned the world is chaos.
And isn't it what the Trumps of the world are talking about?
Trump has got a different agenda, which claims to be America first. And it is, I mean, in the sense it's American corporations. He claims that if he can cut trade ties with China, then the US can bring the jobs back. That's his claim. It's clearly not working because the manufacturing sector has not revived. What it's really showing is Trump is a con man and he wants to negotiate a better deal for the campaign contributors from corporations who've gotten massive tax cuts until very recently, a Wall Street at the highest levels, what we call a sugar high economy. And you take lots of sugar, you feel high, but it's not real. And so Trump claims that he's working for ordinary Americans, but we have to watch the particular states. Those are Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. They're called the Rust Belt, right? Those are the states with the old factories that have been shut down. Look, they may never be reopened. And I would look at the people like Michael Moore, a comedian who comes from that working class tradition in Michigan. And they're very curious because they know that their working class labor aristocracy have been dethroned. These very miserable and now more racist and sexist, xenophobic white workers who would have voted for Barack Obama in 2008, 2012, but then voted for Trump, they're confused. And the big debate is whether if you can really offer an alternative, a Bernie Sanders, you'll then get those workers to switch to the left and you'll bring out black women, youth in massive numbers who've never voted. That's the gamble that the Democratic Party is offered by the possibility of breaking the old stalemate of two centrist parties. Trump polarizes on the right. Bernie Sanders offers a potential for more democratic space to bring more people in. I hope that gamble works. I mean, that would be amazing to find US imperialism suddenly having to twist and not follow the dictates of capital, but actually...
Sounds a little idealistic to
I
me.
probably am too idealistic. Yeah, it may well be that one crucial factor above all, like we learned in 2016, Cambridge Analytica got 50 million Facebook accounts and bombed people with misinformation. Jair Bolsonaro came to power in Brazil through that. It's a very interesting question. Will big data, because Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook has said, I don't care what
shape
They shape people's minds. I mean, every advertisement is paid for because whoever's buying it knows that it works to put ideas in your mind.
Could you tell us more about the workers' movement in South Africa?
It's divided, and the tragedy is that this last couple of weeks, as there's a new budget threatening austerity for the public service, will be the only thing to bring the different parts of the labor movement together. So one part, Congress of South African Trade Unions, had always been aligned with the ruling party, the African National Congress, because they came from the same anti-racism tradition, and they had lots of rhetoric about a freedom charter that would solve problems for workers. The ANC, unfortunately, even under Nelson Mandela, whom I worked for, adopted a neoliberal policy that supported capital's interests against these workers. And as a result, the movement split, and the biggest union, metal workers, as well as another mine worker union, pulled out. Now, the dilemma is how do you bring those workers together, and also how do you bring the working class, the top 40% of the people who have jobs, with the massive poor people, literally 60% who are
out of.
And what's the
production
vehicle?
process?
Yes, they're peasants. They're very poor. They're barely surviving. They're youth. Their unemployment rate is around 40%. So how do you bring them together? So the last couple of weeks was an indicator that for the first time, the Treasury, the Finance Ministry, would be the magnet of unity against them. I saw this the last time, I must say. I lived in South Africa 30 years. At the end of apartheid, it was a beautiful coalition, a mass democratic movement of workers and poor people, feminists, anti-racists, the youth. I mean, it was a united front of the best tradition. And then lots of splits, and the 1990s and 2000s were neoliberal. But what I've been seeing the last little while is a sense we have to pull that kind of coalition of the mass of poor and working people. What they don't really have is a party, a political party that will bring them there. There's a left-wing opposition party, but it's disarticulated. It hasn't found its base within this mass angry populace. So the protest rate is about the highest in the world, and I think when the South African president comes to St. Petersburg for the BRICS meeting in September, he's going to be very nervous. His name is Cyril Ramaphosa. He has a bad reputation because of a massacre where he was a big investor in the company.
2012?
2012, it's called Marikana.
Oh, yeah.
And the company was called Lonmin. And unfortunately, this President Ramaphosa had sent emails 24 hours before the massacre calling the workers on a wildcat strike dastardly criminals. And the police came in and shot 34. That's the stain that former labor leader, Ramaphosa, will carry. And then you'll also have others who are under stress. So Modi has been witnessing the most intense protests over his Islamophobic legislation, right, the citizenship law. Bolsonaro is under constant protest threat. And I think you're finding at the point where the BRICS come together, the most vulnerable layer in the world elites and the most potential for the world working class. Whether the Chinese can find their voice, the Hong Kong activists who want democracy, right, the Uyghur Muslims, but also workers and environmentalists who are always protesting. They're under a special threat called social credit, where the surveillance system is watching them. So if they're going to protest, they may never get on an airplane again.
Yeah. What's missing is the communication.
And also what's missing is the Russians. So what we've experienced many times is inspiration from this country. I mean, 1917, right? Absolutely phenomenal.
Are you still looking at Russia from the outside as a source of inspiration?
Yeah, and the reason is, this is a country that has a nostalgia, because there was a period. So I felt that here in my discussions with people who are experts in Africa. And there was a period in the 90s where Yeltsin didn't care, and I think a current period where greed has overtaken solidarity. And I've felt a nostalgia for the Soviet Union amongst professionals who feel Africa and Russia should be close. I was at the Patrice Lumumba University, right, the People's Friendship University, and I feel the traditions in which the Soviet Union's citizenry welcomed an international solidaristic mutual aid system. And I'd love to see a citizens' connectivity. And I can feel it occasionally. I mean, let's just say, for example, you have environmentalists here who are worried about Rosatom moving all over the world, selling technology that I don't think countries like Zambia or Ghana or Nigeria or Egypt, nuclear technologies that they should be working with. These are pretty risky activities. I mean, Chernobyl, but even more recently, Fukushima, or in the US, 3 Mile Island. So I know in South Africa when we were fighting, we had Russian allies to help us to say, hey, these are the problems with the technology. And I think if Russia's pushing arms and nuclear technology, or steel plants through Roman Abramovich, or credit through VTB, the connections between the elites might look good, but underground, underneath, people are angry at that kind of Russia. And on the other hand, when we see Russians out demanding social justice, demanding more democratic freedoms, our heart is warm. We are reminded of Bolsheviks. We also have a great reminder that Lenin and Bukharin, and maybe there's a Russian who cannot be named, Leon Trotsky, and they had some intellectual and political lessons that every progressive around the world should be relearning, because imperialism did not go away. After the Cold War ended, it's come back in ever more extreme forms. And the Russian model of fighting, which was to take a layer of army, of workers, find Soviets, find democratic forms, those are lessons I think we still should be trying to implement.
You mentioned Trotsky. You probably are aware that Stalin is a little bit more popular within the masses these days in Russia. What do you make of it?
Well, I can imagine that. I mean, I've learned about contradictions in the Soviet Union during the period, let's say, 40s, 50s, 60s, even you could say the 30s, when Trotsky was describing it as a deformed worker state. There are others who said, actually, what had happened here looked a lot more like workers losing control of the means of production, the Soviet being smashed, and a bureaucracy, an apparatchik layer, which you could call a capitalist class. And those are the Trotskyist critiques of class formation in a revolution that goes sour, which means I think if there were a free debate, as actually in Cuba, Trotsky's ideas are openly for debating. I'm not a Trotskyist. I'm not trying to say we need a vanguard party in the same style. But I do think we need those spirits of self-activity of workers as a central value to help explain if that didn't happen here after Lenin died. And in the 20s, so much power from the Soviets was taken away. Maybe there's something there. Now, I say this as an outsider, and I know that Trotsky was murdered by Stalin in 1940 because he was becoming too much of an irritant, and the certain kind of speaking truth to power that wasn't tolerated then surely must be today. I mean, frankly, we're sufficiently irrelevant that to at least have a critical self-examination of what Trotsky said about the Soviet Union, he said it about South Africa, he said it about the United States, and his simple message is usually self-activity of the working class, democratic power from below is the most valuable component of our socialist movement.
In April, we'll be celebrating the 150th anniversary of Lenin. To you and to your comrades, people who you associate yourself with, what is that person?
Yeah.
What is the meaning of it?
It's a good question because the name is contested. I mean, you could go to China and find Leninists. Everyone's a Leninist, Maoist, a Leninist, Stalinist, Leninist. I think the tradition that I respected the most, and many of the comrades that I understand have looked back in early 20th century European and Soviet history, would actually be Rosa Luxemburg. And the reason is simple. Her contradictions in always fighting capitalism, in 1919, a bloody death, because she was fighting so hard. It was intolerable for the Social Democrats to even have a communist. And I think the spirit, the mass strike, her theory of imperialism, her humanity, I think the spirit of Luxemburg is the kind of attraction for those of us always in struggle. That is, it combines capital with all the manifestations of super exploitation, whether you're a woman or a youth or you're concerned about environment. There is something in that tradition. Luxemburg and Lenin had disputes, but they were in the same revolutionary tradition. I think we find it difficult to track revolutionary politics beyond the 1920s. It's been very difficult. We've had false starts, third worldists, we've had a Castro and a Chavez, we've had a Ho Chi Minh, but these traditions don't have the durability that we can look 100 years ago. And I think if that's the case, that is, the material conditions suggest Luxemburg or Lenin describing imperialism in their different ways, it's very relevant. But the vehicles, revolutionary parties, mass strikes, they're going to have to update for the extraordinarily difficult conditions that new technologies, that ethnic fragmentations and xenophobia, they all present ways, identity contradictions that have emerged that require our new left strategists to be as strong as they can. And I look at the most difficult place, like United States, and you see Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or you see the contradictions in the environment, and you see a Greta Thunberg, or you see these student movements in Chile, or even in South Africa, which won free education 3 years ago. There is hope. There's hope in the next generation. And if the next generation is fighting only on generational grounds, which they should be angry with all of us who are older for not solving a crisis that threatens their future, climate crisis. But once they move beyond simply generational rage and add all of the manifestations in which capitalism does damage, then the conversations become
more
really
serious.
hopeful. Yeah.
So be it. Thank you so much. Thank you, sir. I really
Thank you
appreciate
very
it.
much. Great to be with you.
Thanks.